Welcome to the Machon Shilo channel, Jonathan Pollard.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Jonathan spent 30 years in prison for the Jewish people. Thank you, Jonathan, for your sacrifice for the Jewish nation. Thank you for your having chosen to endure torture by the American government rather to rat on your fellow Jews. I don't know how many people have thanked you for that, but that's something you should have been thanked for. Thank you for continuing to sacrifice on behalf of the Jewish nation by speaking those uncomfortable truths which incur the hatred of those who prefer comfortable lies. At this moment of existential danger to the Jewish people, your words and your wisdom and your knowledge are more vital than ever. And my great hope is that they will have some influence in leading us towards Jewish victory. Now, Rabbi David Bar-Hayim, the head of Machon Shilo, will have a few words to say.
Shalom Aleichem. Welcome to all. I'm very pleased and honored to be part of this podcast. I only came to know Jonathan Pollard a few months ago, perhaps half a year ago. And Baruch Hashem, I can say, I think, without danger of being contradicted, that it's not just Jonathan Pollard, it's my friend, Jonathan Pollard. This is not the time, nor do I have all the information at my fingertips to begin to relate the heroic deeds of Jonathan for the Jewish people. On another occasion, perhaps, we might discuss some of those things, how Jonathan's life took various turns and led him in various directions. That would probably also be a very illuminating and interesting podcast to have at some point in the future. But today, of course, because of our current situation, which began with the horrific attacks on Shmini Asereth, on Kaf Aleph B'Tishrei, Tavshin Pei Daled, the 7th of October, 2023, Leminyanam. Things, of course, have taken a turn. Whether it's a turn for the worse or for the better, I think depends in large measure on how we behave and what we do today and in the coming days, in the coming months and years. And precisely, it is about such things that we are pleased to have Jonathan Pollard with us today. And we all look forward, I'm sure, as I certainly do, to hear his insights and his understandings and prognostications for the future. Without further ado, bevakasha, it's all yours.
Thank you. I've been asked by many people, Rabbi, over the past few weeks, how is it that we can exist on our own without the United States as our guarantor? How is it that we could plot a course of independence without first taking Washington's needs and views into account? I've been shocked, basically, at the kind of craven attitude that a lot of people at the higher reaches of our government have exhibited since October 7th. The fact of the matter is, we can exist quite well as long as we have Yirat Shamayim. This is how I existed in prison for 30 years. Yes, it was the love of a good woman, my wife, Esther, Alei Shalom. But it was also my rock-solid fear of heaven for doing the wrong thing, for adopting a cowardly demeanor or policy towards anybody. it was my wife, who was my morah, that taught me something very important that I live by now. It's better to be afraid of heaven than it is the biggest, meanest, murderous person in the world. Why? Because God runs the world. That's why. Hashem runs the world. And if you keep that in mind, the United States is just another empire. I think it was Lord Palmerston who once said, and I could be wrong on the author, but it was a British source. He said, countries have permanent interests, not permanent friendships. And that applies in spades with the case of the United States. And if you don't believe me, you can ask the Afghans, the Vietnamese, and a whole host of other countries, the Ukrainians included, how it is that a country that could be so assertive in their commitments to defense and economic support and political help could just turn their back on a country and walk away. The fact of the matter is, the United States has not always been an ally of Israel. Yes, Harry Truman, President Truman, recognized Israel. And then what? And then he just basically let us float. There was an arms embargo, which didn't hurt the Arabs because they were getting it from all sorts of vendors. But it certainly hurt us badly in 1948. So it really wasn't until many, many, many decades later that we suddenly, for America's interests, suddenly became allied to this empire. So when people say, how can we possibly have an army, a great army, without the assistance of the United States? The fact of the matter is, there are two things to keep in mind. Number one, there isn't any military system that we've purchased that we've received from the United States that we couldn't have developed ourselves, either by ourselves or in association with other countries. Number two, and this equipment that we're getting is not exactly given free of charge. How do I say that? Why do I say that? The Americans have had a policy of destroying the Israeli military-industrial complex. And they do that by conditioning their aid, that the aid can only be used in the United States to purchase American-manufactured weapons. So actually, all these billions of dollars are actually a form of corporate welfare for the American military-industrial complex. Now, is this a bad thing? Well, if I'm an American, no. Good for them. They're looking after their own. Is it good for us? No, absolutely not. Some people say, well, why don't we just convert the aid? As Bibi once said during his first speech to the joint session of Congress, we don't need any economic help anymore. And as far as military assistance, we should have co-production agreements. We should have joint R&D arrangements. Well, the problem with that is it sounds very good, but the Americans would have a hammerlock on who we could sell this equipment to. And they've done that repeatedly, where equipment that we've produced jointly, either through co-production or through a joint R&D project, has been denied to us to sell. That the Americans said, no, we'll go ahead and sell the equipment. You don't. So that's the second thing that we have to keep in mind. Number one, we can produce it ourselves. Number two, it's not so much to help us as so much as it is a form of corporate welfare for the American military industrial complex. The third thing that we have to keep in mind, and this is the principal reason why we have to get ourselves off this addiction to American military assistance, and it is an addiction, is if we had to pay for our own military equipment, we would destroy our enemies in short order. Why? Because our economy couldn't handle this prolonged state of ambiguity with regard to our threats. Is it a threat? Is it not a threat? Shall we just kick the can down the road? Shall we just manage the enemy? Shall we mow the grass? No. If we had to actually pay out of taxes for our military equipment, for our army, the army's mindset would be completely different. The mindset would be one of taking care of business, eliminating threats, not negotiating or managing them. But it's just like, I liken it, compare it to the Great Society, welfare in the United States, when welfare was given to the underclasses by President Johnson and his Great Society. And what did it do? It destroyed the initiative of people to actually go out and work. Why should they? They can just go to the government and get a handout. So it's the same thing here. Why should we waste our taxes building equipment when the Americans will just give it to us on condition that we either don't use it or we use it in a way that's consistent with their agenda, their national security agenda, their geopolitical agenda. We've had an example of this just recently when Anthony Blinken, who is one of the most mentally challenged individuals I've ever heard in my life, next to Jake Sullivan. I never thought anybody could make Jake Sullivan, of all people, look good. Well, Tony Blinken can. This statement that he made a few days ago at the conclusion of the G7 meeting in Tokyo, where he proclaimed Mahmoud Abbas and the PA are going to go back to Gaza, and there's going to be a two-state solution involving the territories and Gaza. And he went on in this vein, totally delusional. And I understood at that point why some people, several years ago, were insistent that high-ranking government officials, cabinet officials in particular, take drug tests, because it was apparent that what they were saying was either because of some kind of hallucinogenic drug they were taking, or because they were just criminally incompetent and should be removed from office. And unfortunately, this third administration of Barack Obama, masquerading as the first Biden administration, is guilty of all these things. They have people that are just totally incompetent, they're totally woke, and they're totally out of their league. The point of the matter is, Israel can get along quite well without a superpower guarantor. Now, if you don't believe in Yirat Shamayim, okay, I can understand that. However, you can believe in the fact that we are at least the fourth largest nuclear power in the world. And a country that has that kind of arsenal shouldn't be crawling on its knees to an incompetent end of empire administration like the Biden administration. We are a superpower, and we just can't understand that. When I gave a series of lectures to high-ranking officers when I came home, I asked them very quite frankly, who can tell me why we devoted such treasure and such resources to Dimona? And the answer was, well, it's a deterrent. It was to be a deterrent. And I immediately said, well, gentlemen, here's a news flash. Our enemies are not afraid of us anymore. So what are we to do with Dimona? Nobody knew. I said, we are to use it. And of course, the oxygen went out of the room at that point. And I proceeded, and I've written about this, to detail what I call the 20-minute war against Iran. I'm using this as an example. Everybody knows that the United States is not going to really go after the Iranian nuclear weapons complex. They just aren't. They aren't going to go to war, period, against the Iranians. You could say, well, they have, the Indo-Pacific to worry about. But they were long gone from the Middle East before that became a strategic necessity for the United States. So I told them, these gentlemen, no amount of conventional bombing will do much of anything to either retard or
excuse me,
destroy.
Jonathan, may I interrupt you for one moment and
Sure.
ask a question? Perhaps you could explain why it is that the United States will not go to war with Iran, even in order to put an end to their nuclear ambitions.
Right. There are two reasons. Actually, in honesty, three. The first is this fixation that Israel has that the United States has with China. China is, without question, the greatest threat posed to American supremacy right now, global supremacy. So the United States is fixated to a very large extent on what's called the Indo-Pacific. And their strategy and their strategic thinking is all geared towards fighting, as it was in the Second World War, the Great Pacific War, to take a phrase that was used before the Second World War, the Great Pacific War. It completely occupies their every waking moment. And so the Middle East, to a very large extent, is of secondary importance to the United States strategically. The second reason is that there is some feeling amongst the woke members of the American left-wing political elite that Iran, for some reason, should be accepted, along with its nuclear arsenal and along with its madness, Shia madness, millennial madness, as a counterbalancing power of some sort in the Middle East. So you have this geostrategic fixation with the Indo-Pacific. You have this very criminally naive notion that Iran really isn't that much of a threat if you just try to deal with it. I call it criminally naive because everybody else in the world understands exactly the kind of threat that's being posed by the Iranians, except the United States. So there's a perceptual problem that certain members of the American political and military elite have in understanding the kind of threat posed by Iran, not just to the regional order, but to the international order as well. The third reason, and this is a hard one for people to accept, is that the American army can't fight. Just can't get their mind around it. Yes, they beat the hell out of Iraq twice. Was that a real war? No, it was a punching bag. I mean, there was just no way that the United States could lose. Okay. So there's a disinclination on the part of the United States to get into any kind of conflict at all, even one that they could easily win.
Jonathan?
Yes.
Are we to understand what you're saying as being that the American ships, can we derive from what you're saying that the American ships which have been sent here are a part of a type of bluff and will not be used?
That's what I've been saying ever since the first carrier battle group was deployed to the Eastern Mediterranean. In a 7-hour diatribe that Tony Blinken had with the War Cabinet, he raised two issues, and they were both threats. The first threat was that unless and until Israel agreed to open up a humanitarian corridor to relieve the pressures on the poor innocent people of Gaza, there would be no military equipment made available to Israel, period. So Bibi buckled. The second threat that was made was that if we actually went first and launched I would call it a preventive I can't say preemptive because I don't really know what the intentions are of Hezbollah. So I'll call it a preventive strike against Hezbollah that the United States would not be involved. You could imagine the ships just sailing over the horizon and saying goodbye. So what they were demanding, what Tony Blinken was demanding, was the same thing that that vile animal, Henry Kissinger, demanded of us in the fall of 1973. First, by denying a war was coming, and then threatening us that if we preempted it, there would be penalties, there would be dire consequences to Israel for having done so. Same thing. This is like 1973 redux right now. So the United States is here to, yes, to deter the war from spreading, mainly because it doesn't want to get involved in a war. They're not doing it for our benefit. Their presence is acting as a deterrent to us, not to the Hezbollah, and certainly not to the Iranians. The Iranians have already taken the measure of the United States, and they know they're basically a paper tiger. There just isn't anything to it. The United States isn't going to start bombing Iranian targets. They'll beat the hell out of, maybe out of the Houthis, maybe out of the militia groups in Syria, maybe out of the militia groups in Iraq, maybe. Hezbollah, I don't know what they're going to hit. God forbid they should kill some Lebanese, one or two Lebanese civilians. So, you know, they aren't going to bomb. If they were to get involved, they aren't going to bomb targets in Beirut or Tyre or Sidon or any of these other cities, because they might kill civilians. And we already see what they've done to us on that issue, even though they killed over 500,000 Iraqis in 2 wars and didn't give a damn about it one way or the other. So we'll leave that to the side. So to answer your question, no. The Americans have poured military resources into the area primarily to deter us from potentially involving them in a war against Iran and Hezbollah, which they don't want any part of. That is, the United States does not want any part of this. I'll give you a reason why. The United States has been hit dozens and dozens and dozens of times. Dozens and dozens and dozens of times by Iranian proxy groups, both in Syria and Iraq. And what have they done? Nothing. Negative nothing. What do I mean by that? I already saw the satellite pictures of what they hit. It was a joke. When you have 20 targets, I'll give you an example, and you hit one, what does that tell you? You can't hit the other 19? No. You've chosen not to hit the other 19. There's no resistance. There's no surface air missile, defenses that are going to, impede the elimination of the other 19 sites. And it's not a question of proportional responses. It's virtue signaling, in a sense, telling the Iranians, look, we got to hit you back somewhere. We don't want a war with you. Yeah, you wounded a bunch of our people. You slammed a bunch of our facilities in Iraq and Syria. But, we understand the pressures on you to actually show like you're doing something to support your proxy force in Gaza. We understand that. If the United States were a serious player in this in this dust-up right now, in this war, they would have taken out every single Iranian munitions dump on the Syrian-Iraqi border. We know where they are. If I know where they are by looking at, commercially available satellite photography, I'm sure the Americans do. Why didn't they do that? Why? Because they either can't get their minds around actually engaging in a war, full-on war, which is part of the problem. But more than that, they have this fixation with the Indo-Pacific, so they don't want to waste their time or resources here if they don't have to. And thirdly, they really don't hold this kind of grudge against the Iranians as we do. Now you think, how can that be? I mean, they killed over 200 Marines in Beirut. They've launched the Khobar Towers bombing. I don't know, 70 people killed in that. I mean, they have been at war with the United States ever since the mullahs took over. But the United States, for one reason or another, believes, well, if we don't accept that fact, then we're not at war. It's a really cockeyed view of geopolitics, but that's the way it is. So the bottom line on this is, if the Americans,
Jonathan, a question.
Let me just finish on one point,
okay,
if I can.
Sure.
That if the Americans were genuinely serious about that, we would the United States would basically, I have problems with pronouns sometimes. The United States would basically say, if you hit us one more time, it doesn't matter whether it's via a proxy force or whatever. If our troops or our facilities are hit, you lose something of strategic importance and value to you. What could that be? Well, Cargill and who knows what. There are a whole list of facilities in the targeting bank that the United States could take out that would get their attention. And if they would go ahead and strike Saudi Arabia or UAE or all these other countries in the Gulf in retaliation, the United States should welcome the opportunity, basically, to take them off the map at that point. That's it. Done. And the United States certainly could do that in 24 hours.
Two questions which complement each other. Number one, why, in your view, is the United States unwilling to do certain things vis-a-vis Iran today, whereas in the past they were willing to do such things with Iraq? As you said, on twice, not once. And secondly, would you agree with the assessment that this American reluctance or squeamishness with regards to going to war against Iran, which is obviously, as you state, which has been at war with the United States for decades, would you agree with the assessment that this has something to do with a woke view of the world, namely that the United States, when all is said and done, is a white colonialist power
with guilt,
which in the past took down a democratically elected Iranian government, as we all know.
Most of them,
right.
And Pinochet,
as the United States, as the CIA has done in about 70 or 80 countries over the past 80 years.
Correct.
That's for anyone who knows anything about the real world in which we live, and the CIA and the American deep state is aware of these facts. Does it have something to do, therefore, with a woke conception of the world, whereby people...
It's called a guilty conscience.
People who are not...
It's the woke, guilty conscience.
Right. Non-WASP, non-white-skinned people are always in some way morally superior and correct, and therefore they have to be collie-modeled.
Okay, let me address the first issue of Iraq. And I know quite a bit about that, because that was actually one of the reasons why I became an Israeli agent. The Americans were deeply involved with supporting Iraq during their war with Iran. And they supported them all the way through the war. And it wasn't so much because they were opposed to the radical Islamist, the Shia Islamist ideology of the mullahs, but it was because the Saudis saw Iraq as kind of a bulwark of defense against a possible Shia invasion or subversion of the state, because the eastern part of Saudi Arabia, which has most of their oil, is a Shia inhabited area. So the Saudis are particularly sensitive to any kind of threat to that region, either indirectly through subversion or directly through invasion. So the United States immediately snapped to and defended this barbaric regime in Baghdad. Things changed when Saddam Hussein, for various reasons, decided to invade Kuwait. And it wasn't just Kuwait that was the ultimate target. The Saudi oil fields, he had plans to go on to Bahrain, to Qatar, to the UAE. I mean, he was a megalomaniac, but the initial strike was for Kuwait and its oil. And at that point, the Saudis screamed for help, and American foreign policy pivoted and became anti-Iraqi. The Iranians, of course, couldn't do anything since they lost the war, the Iran-Iraq war. So we didn't have to really worry about them too much at that point. As far as this kind of Frantz Fanon approach to the wretched of the earth, yeah, look, when I was in university and graduate school at Stanford and Harvard, MIT, there was a very, very small group of left-wingers that scared the hell out of the rest of us because of the zeal with which they took on what you described as this white colonialist guilt complex. I mean, the Europeans are dying because of it right now. And we're starting it. Again, the pronouns. The United States is starting it right now. They've reached the peak, and now they're on the way down because of these people. Look at the protests right now on university campuses. The bulk of the student body is so passive. It's like Weimar Germany. They're just so passive in the face of this zealousness, mindless zealousness on the part of these woke, left-wing, white, privileged kids, that they have the form. You can see it in the Democratic Party, in fact. There is no centrist Democratic Party anymore, in fact. The party of Lyndon Johnson and Hubert Humphrey doesn't exist anymore. It's the lefties. It's their extreme left that basically run the Democratic Party, if not in numbers, certainly in ideology. Why? It's because the Democrats can't win an election without them. That's the problem. Now, when you see society as a whole, the bulk of the United States, I've been reading the polls, is solidly pro-Israel, Democrat and Republican. But when the media gets together with this left-wing agenda that they have, they give the impression through their reportage that the country is in fact behind Hamas. I mean, it's insane. There's no reason for it. But the motivation behind all of this is ultimately white guilt. And as you pointed out, it's this colonialist mentality they have. But I'll tell you one thing, and I've had a lot of discussions with these guys that didn't end too well, but I've always asked them the same thing. I'd say, look, instead of worrying about this one country or this one particular oppressed people overseas, why don't you go into the inner city and help them? Why don't you go out to the Indian reservations and help them? Why don't you do that? Well, they don't want to do that. Why? Well, because they have a very privileged attitude towards this whole thing. They would rather protest. They would rather march around with signs and virtue signaling than actually do anything constructive. I faced this problem at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, which is run by an MIT, Harvard, Tufts University consortium, where I was placed for reasons I didn't realize on the divestment committee of Tufts University. Quite a bit of money. This was for South Africa. And I went to my first meeting, and I was shocked at the criminal naivete of these white privileged kids talking about, the oppressed Bantus of South Africa. And I had enough of it. And I said, have any of you been to South Africa? No. I said, well, I have. Do any of you understand what the Sullivan Act is about? This was a congressional resolution requiring American businesses in South Africa basically to treat their Black employees at the same level, in the same way as their white employees. It was empowering a Black middle class. And those Africans, the Blacks that I knew in South Africa, were begging me to keep American investment in South Africa because it was the only way they could get ahead, really get ahead. So when I brought this all up, they were horrified.
It should be pointed out for a moment that you actually lived in South Africa.
Yeah, I did. I was
for
there
a number of years.
Yeah, I was a little over a year.
Uh-huh.
I had relatives there, not anymore, but I had relatives there, and I honestly, I kind of liked it quite a bit. This was not at a good time, you know. It was around 75, but it's a beautiful country. But at any rate, it didn't pass. The divestment resolution didn't pass because it had to be unanimous. And I had a lot of criticism in the press over that. And when I went in to see the dean of the graduate school that I attended, I said to him, "Why in God's name did you subject me to all of this?" And he said, "Because I knew you would oppose this insane divestment policy." I said, "Well, okay." The problem for me, it wasn't so much a problem as an advantage for me, is I grew up overseas. And so I had a very, very deep appreciation for different cultures, their good side as well as their bad side. So I wasn't starry-eyed about the third world. You know, once you've traveled through West Africa and spent a lot of time there, you really understand that there are two sides to every issue. And sometimes in the third world, there are 4, 5, or 6 sides to everything. So I didn't have this kind of naive, starry-eyed, or guilt-ridden view of the oppressed of the earth, right? The one thing that I always emphasize to these people is decolonization actually takes 2 forms. It's not only allowing certain countries to become independent, but it also requires you to divest your mind, to remove from your mind the notion of colonial guilt. You didn't do it. You know, your ancestors did it. So why are you inflicting such guilt on yourself? It's ridiculous. You have to look forward. You have to look to the future. They don't want to hear that. They are forever looking back on what they perceive to have happened in the past and how they can somehow correct it now because of their white privilege. They're equally responsible for what happened in the past. It's insane. And you talk to them about geopolitics and strategic realities and things. They don't understand it. You're talking Greek or Chinese to them. They just don't get. We are the United States. Pronouns again. The United States is probably the most ignorant empire that ever existed. Totally insular, totally provincial, totally ignorant. Most of the kids in university I know could hardly speak English, let alone some foreign language. And that came as a great shock to me because I grew up in a family where French, German, Yiddish, Russian was spoken. So languages were always a part of my life. You can't understand a culture unless you can speak their language. But these kids here, in the American university system, did they speak Spanish? My father spoke Spanish and Portuguese fluently. Did they speak Spanish or Portuguese? No. Did they speak French or German? No. Did they speak Italian? No. They didn't speak anything except guilt. So this is the burden right now that we in Israel are living under. When you say to these people, for example, like a Jake Sullivan or a Tony Blinken or any of these horrible people, do you understand where we live? No, because we live in their imagination somewhere else. And they will fight to the last drop of our blood to somehow deal with this white privilege guilt. That's what's going on right now.
Because they view us in the
as white colonial
as
powers.
white colonialists. We're
Yeah.
white colonialists in the Middle East.
And my Mizrahi and Sephardi friends just laugh hysterically at that.
Right. We're not indigenous in any way. We have no real
of
roots
course
here. We're just white colonialists, like whites in Rhodesia
or Kenya. You know, we're the Brits that went up country and started the tea plantations. You know, it's out of Africa type stuff. Yeah, it's incredibly, as I said, the university system in the United States is kind of like the Peter principle, in the sense that it's the rot they rise to their level of incompetence, and I couldn't believe it. I just couldn't believe it.
Jonathan?
Yes.
You've stated that unfortunately, because of all of the criminal negligence that's been happening, the Hezbollah could start bombing us, and within 2-3 weeks we could be in a terrible situation.
One day.
Even one day, fine.
One day.
What if such a war were to break out tomorrow morning? What do you think should be done, and what do you think may tragically be done?
If we actually accede to the American demand not to go first, we leave the strategic initiative to the enemy, which is always a bad thing. We allow them, in professional terms, we allow them to, quote, shape the battlefield. What that could mean, what that probably will mean, is all our power stations, well, go back. Our air defenses will be overwhelmed. They're overwhelmed now. This is why we have leakage. You keep hearing about missiles that are hitting cities. And the reason for that is, over the past few wars that we've had with Hamas, they've been firing more and more missiles at a given battery to see how many it would take to overwhelm that battery's defensive capability. Well, now they've got the number. And this is why we have leakage. We have to basically husband our interceptor arsenal. Why? Well, because the military high command told us long before this war started that if war kicks off, the home front is on its own. They've been very blunt about this, and people haven't listened and asked the appropriate questions like, why? And can't you do anything about that? So right now, most of our missiles are being reserved for strategic defensive strategic sites. Now, if we can't really handle the Hamas missile threat, what are we going to do with Hezbollah? Well, what will happen is we will be completely swamped on day one. What does that mean in practical terms? Power stations, reverse osmosis facilities, freshwater facilities, water treatment plants, hospitals, other communication centers are gone, would be gone. They could, within 24 hours, put us back in the Stone Age. And I'm not being alarmist. The last thing in the world that I would want to be is alarmist, because you don't think straight when you're alarmist. I'm being very practical. Would they come across the border? Well, they're smart, and they understand that there are really no hostages to take now, because we've evacuated the northern frontier. It's almost like an own goal. Why? The South is depopulated, along with 75% now of our vegetables, which are grown down south. So Hamas accomplished that much. If you look to the north, we immediately started evacuating people from our northern communities, and this was the plan all along, so they wouldn't be taken hostage. Why? Because we aren't going to go first. That's why. That's the dirty secret, because the Americans don't want us to go first. So what do we do in a case like that? Well, we have to take our citizens away. So now the bulk of our fruit, which is grown up north, is now rotting on the trees. So our agriculture from the south to the north has now been dealt a body blow, basically by us, by not taking a more aggressive strategic perspective on the threat. We shouldn't have had to evacuate our southern communities. We should have gone first. We shouldn't have had to evacuate our northern communities and lose, again, all the agricultural potential that's up there, just because the Americans demand that we receive the first shot. I mean, what is this, like the Battle of Fontenoy, where one general said to the other, "Gentlemen, you may have the first shot"? I mean, there was a reason for that back then, but there's no reason for it now. So in the event Hezbollah decides to go, I don't really know what's going to happen to our airfields. They have all the precision munitions they need, and it's called pin down. And they can keep our airfields pinned down for an indefinite period of time. Now, there are ways around that by basing aircraft on roads. Okay, instead of using an airfield, you use a road. But they're smart, and they have an army of traitors in this country who will immediately apprise them of any kind of relocation of the Air Force to use the road system. So I don't know how long, and they wouldn't have any protective shelters there. So I don't know how long that would last. Would they come across?
Jonathan,
would they come across the border? Well, this Radwan force that they have, I hate to say this, is every bit as good as our army, and they've got about 10,000 of them. So would they be able to, since there are no hostages, would they be satisfied with just occupying territory? Occupying a kibbutz, occupying a moshav, occupying a village? Yeah, probably. And then they would go on the strategic defense or the tactical defense and make us take it back. Well, it's a rule of thumb that when you have to go on the attack against an entrenched, well-trained enemy, you're going to lose a lot of people. So yes, I'm not saying it will be a Pyrrhic victory, but for us, I would. The generals wouldn't, because they say, well, we recovered our territory that never should have been evacuated, never should have been allowed to be endangered. And just as it is with Gaza,
Jonathan, allow me to ask you the following. Everything that you have been describing must lead us to the following question, or two questions. A, why did Hezbollah not attack on the same day as Hamas? Why didn't they? Why was it not? It seems not to have been coordinated, which I find surprising. As soon as I heard about what was going on in the south, I said to a number of people, well, I imagine any moment, any hour,
going to cook off up north.
It will take off in the north as well, because it cannot be that this was not coordinated. And I admit that I was surprised that did not happen. That's number one.
The Iranians and Hezbollah were surprised also, by the way.
All right, well, that seems to be the answer, but that's also surprising that it was not coordinated, that it was not part of a well-coordinated master plan, which, as you're pointing out very correctly, had they entered the fray on that first day, who can say where we would be today? That's number one. Number two, even if they, for whatever reason, did not do it on the first day, as you say, apparently because they themselves were surprised, although I'm not sure how much one can really believe that. How surprised could the Iranians be if they trained some of these Hamas fighters for years, apparently, for precisely such an operation? So how surprised could they be? But even if they did not do so on the first or the second day, why are they not doing so today or tomorrow? Tomorrow, who knows? But let's say today.
One story that I've heard is that when this rave occurred, this party occurred,
right?
It was so tempting to Hamas that they moved prematurely, not preemptively, prematurely. They saw such a group of targets, and they killed like 250 or more there.
160, 70, yes.
Yeah, that they lost their perspective on joint operations. They lost their commitment to joint operations. That was one theory of what's going on. The other theory is that it might have been coordinated, but Hezbollah decided at the last moment to let the Hamas basically take the first hit. What's been going on? We have gone through a lot of interceptors, Tamir intercept, Iron Dome interceptors. We've committed a great portion of our army to Gaza, to a siege of Gaza, which eats up material and manpower more than a regular open field battle does. So a large part of our army and our resources are more or less pinned down right now and can't get out even if we wanted to, because we're committed to finishing this off, supposedly, come what may. So we could be very cynical and say, well, the Iranians are just using Hamas to exhaust us until they decide to come in and initiate their own offensive up north. They also know that there wasn't anybody to take. I mean, the minute this thing cooked off in the south, we were already starting evacuating people quickly from our northern frontier. So I don't know if we'll ever find out exactly why this multi-front war didn't occur at the time that it should have. Now we're hearing that, well, the plan actually was Pesach, that at Pesach it was supposed to happen. Well, and that this last Pesach, and that the Iranians were conflicted as to whether they should do it or not, because they were in the middle of this negotiations with the United States to release American hostages for $6 billion. And that they therefore delayed this coordinated attack in order to get the money. I don't know. What I do know is that those kids that were at the rave, say what you will, died al Kiddush Hashem, because they may have saved us all from a horrible, horrible situation. If I believe that the target that they presented was so tempting that it just overwhelmed Hamas's ability to reason and abide by the need for jointness with the Hezbollah and the Iranians. But right now, there's just no way of knowing what happened. This affects, of course, our understanding of what Hezbollah is going to do. Because to the extent, as time goes on and the threat from Hamas diminishes by the day, Hezbollah is faced with a very difficult situation at that point. The issue of a multi-front war has just lost one front. If our government, and I just wrote a piece about this, which I think will be coming out in our Sheva today. The other front that Hezbollah and the Iranians are counting on is a terror offensive in the territories. And my point that I tried to make in this piece, and Carolyn Glick came out with a piece today about this as well, it's the Americans who are behind this. The Americans just recently allowed Israel to buy a large quantity of M16 rifles on condition that they only go to police forces, that none of them should go to territorial security squads or to individual settlers in the territories. Why would they say that? Well, again, it's because on the one hand, as you pointed out, they have this kind of woke idea of the settlers being white colonialists oppressing the poor brown natives, right? They've been hyping this whole issue of settler violence, Jewish extremism, ever since they took office. And you look at this and say, what are they talking about?
Please,
what
complete invention, a complete invention.
Yeah, it's creatio ex nihilo. I mean, it's just creation. Okay, so this whole business that they have, this fixation with the two-state delusion, as I call it, really requires a terror threat in the territories of such magnitude that it basically clears out the air. It makes it Judenrein. And the Palestinians take it by default at that point. There's a state that it comes into creation, God forbid. And if you look at what our government has done or not done over the past couple of years, it looks like, well, we're playing along with that. We've allowed this massive illegal building campaign by the PA to occur without really doing anything to stop it. We've allowed a massive influx of weapons of all types to the territories, Arab weapons, which, by the way, the Jordanians are also guilty of permitting. And the one thing that I've been harping on is that Bibi and the generals have categorically refused to decisively defeat terror in the territories. They won't do it. You have this in and out with Jenin, when in fact we should smash Jenin. We should empty those, basically what we're doing now. A year ago, I basically wrote a piece saying we should tell about 30 to 40% of Jenin, get somewhere, because you're not going to have a home left when we get through with you. Leave, go to Ramallah or go to Jordan. And then we simply take Jenin down to its foundations. It's what we should have done with Gaza. It looks like we have, but we haven't. And Bibi, in a conversation I had with him, looked at me like I was Meshuggah. And he said, why would we need to do that? That would really anger the Americans. And I said, who cares what they think? The Iranians have built a terror factory. The Iranians, the PA, and UNRWA, those UN schools, have created a terror factory in Jenin. Surround it, get the 30 or 40% who aren't part of this out, and then level the place. Don't send any troops in there. I have a very close friend, dear friend, who lost a son there on one of these commando raids. I don't want any more parents to suffer, to go through what he and his wife have gone through, especially when we have the capability of using bombs rather than bodies, as I call it, to eliminate a threat. Here's a story. I put a picture up once in front of a bunch of generals, active generals, of a funeral in Jenin, terrorist funeral. And I said to them, can you count how many armed terrorists are in this picture? It was a big picture. It was in 4 parts. It was so big. So they're counting. I said, okay, I'll cut to the chase with you. You don't have to count them all. They're over 500. I said, what do you call that? Nobody said it. I said, that's a target. That isn't mowing the grass. That isn't kicking the can down the road. That isn't managing the problem. That's eliminating the problem. And one hand came up, and this general said to me, Jonathan, we can't do that. And I said, why? Why not? Tell me. He said, you see that child that's being held by his father? We can't do that. I said, you mean the child that's in the Hamas uniform with the green headband carrying the little toy AK-47? That child? I said, I'm not going to exhibit more concern for their children, the enemy's children, than they're willing to exhibit towards them. They're the ones that and it's the same thing, apply that logic to Gaza. So he said, you haven't been in the Israeli army. You don't know about our ethics. And I was ready for that. And I pulled out a pamphlet, The Purity of Arms, written by a left-wing atheist out of Hebrew University. This pamphlet is an avodah zarah.
Asa Kasher. Professor Asa Kasher.
There.
He wrote the supposed Hakod Ha'eti Shel Tzahal,
I read that
and I said, code by which the so-called IDF, of course, the D there doesn't belong there at all, but what they refer to as the IDF, which is the problem, that the fact that we have a D in the middle of those initials is precisely the problem.
We shouldn't have a defensive force. We should have the Army of Israel.
We should have armed forces. We should have armed forces like the American armed forces or the British armed forces, etc., etc. But of course, this has historical roots. Has to do with the Haganah defense.
Yeah,
that's how the Haganah. No, you're talking about Havlaga, but I'm talking about the fact that there was the Haganah, which formed the basis of the army. Yes, of course, I understand. Yeah. But the point is, of course, that we are told by all manner of people, including, unfortunately, and to our everlasting shame, by certain people who are known as rabbis, that is Jewish ethics. But in fact, that has nothing to do with Jewish ethics.
I never found
everything in the Torah teaches us the opposite.
I took the pamphlet.
In a moment, I'll share a couple of sources with regards to that. But please go on.
I took the pamphlet. I said, "Is this what you're talking about?" And they said, "Yes." And I tore it up, and I threw it on the floor. And it was as if, I don't know, I had desecrated the Torah, or something like that. I had destroyed the Egel HaZahav, whatever you want to call it. They were absolutely horrified at what I'd done. And I said, well, I'm more horrified by you. And I pointed at Benny Gantz, admitting that he took pride in sacrificing Jewish soldiers to save Palestinian children.
And he, of course, he is one of 3 members of the war cabinet.
Think about that.
Right.
And, the guy doesn't have 2 brain cells to rub together. And the other one, Gallant, I don't even want to get started. And Bibi, who looks shell-shocked and who can't make a decision. That's the war cabinet? So this is why I feel very strongly that when this war is over, please God, shortly, we have to have a complete cleaning of the military. Everybody's been talking about judicial reform. From the moment I've come here, Rabbi, I've only talked about one thing: military reform. because the same problem that afflicts the Bagats afflicts the military.
Yes, of course, but I must interrupt you and point out that discussing so-called legal reform, which is not really about anything judicial or about laws, it's about a mindset. It's about a diseased and pernicious ideology and philosophy of life, of reality, of everything. That can be, as it were, distilled into what we call the bagats or an academia, etc. And from there, that poisonous
mindset,
philosophy and mindset have permeated the army, not the other way around. So yes, it does begin there, but yes, the army has been completely permeated, completely poisoned.
Rabbi, you won't believe this. I called a friend of mine who is in Gaza right now, a special force officer. And I said to him, do you have any lawyers attached to your unit? And he was quiet, and he said, yes. And I said, can those legal commissars, that's what I call them, those legal commissars overrule the commands of your chain of command? He said, yeah, absolutely. So I said, I've been in situations where people are shooting at me, and you sometimes have milliseconds to respond. It's an instinctive response, because if you don't, you can die. And he said, yeah, we have that problem still. You have to make sure that there are no civilians in a building before you go in. You don't fight a war that way.
No, of course not. In order to move along, let me ask you the following. If you were in charge, what would your policy, how would you go about prosecuting this war from this moment on, and what would be the medium to long-term goal?
3 years ago when I came here, I used to be on a quote red team in the Navy, U.S. Navy, and this was a team that was charged with thinking outside the box. It's that what the enemy might do unexpectedly. It's a certain mindset you have to have. So I was asked to evaluate what our options would be if we had to go into Gaza. I thought about it for a couple of days, and I said the sine qua non of any campaign against Gaza, against Hamas, would be first to order or offer the evacuation of civilians. I'm Jewish. I don't take any pleasure from just killing. My killing is very pointed, right? So we let them go, as many of them as they can. But I'm looking at this scenario was all of Gaza. So there were 4 weapons that I identified that we would need to build in order to prepare Gaza for an Israeli ground invasion. An invasion, I might add, that would face probably zero resistance. I indicated that these 4 weapons could be developed within less than a year and have great export potential as well. And that when we were through, not only would they not be able to fire any rockets at Israel, not only would they not be able to communicate with one another in Gaza, but more importantly, the ventilation system of the tunnels would be finished, dead. They couldn't repair it. So that would force them up. And that's where the other 3 weapons that I outlined would finish them off. Within 1 week, that's the campaign. Why? Because for two reasons. First of all, I assumed that something would happen with Hezbollah. So the campaign would have to be very short in order to redeploy the army, the bulk of the army up north, number one. And number two, we fight short wars because we have a people's army. Right now, 18% of our workforce is now tied up with Gaza. We can't do it. It's not economically feasible to keep the mobilization at this level for the foreseeable future. So I said, the last thing we want to do is pay a butcher's bill fighting Stalingrad on the Mediterranean. The last thing a country like ours should do is fight urban warfare for any number of reasons. So the scenario was 1 week. The bulk of the Arab population in Gaza was out. Khan Yunis, Rafiah, Gaza City, they're all finished, done. The tallest structure would be an anthill. We move in, we annex Gaza, and we turn the page. Half of Gaza, I had suggested, would become a solar park, about a gigawatt of power, which is not bad. We bring back Gush Katif, with all, except this time maybe with vertical industries. And I assumed that we would have to rebuild or expand our Gaza envelope communities, which are all mostly left wing. So we give them a benefit as well. So everybody's happy. And we annex the area. We destroy Hamas. We don't annihilate people. We don't annihilate people, and we annex the area. The paper that I subsequently wrote on the 20-minute war with Iran would occur simultaneously. And yes, it involves a comprehensive nuclear strike, not just against the Iranian nuclear weapons complex, but against Iran itself. There are reasons for that. But the intellectual ability, the knowledge base to rebuild a nuclear weapons facility is disseminated throughout Iran's larger cities. There are think tanks, universities, strategic centers, etc. You have to take it all off the board. And Hezbollah and Syria go with them. What we're talking about is finishing the job. And when I ended this brief, most of the people considered me a barbarian. And my answer to them was, you're right. And you're lucky I'm your barbarian. Now I'm experiencing something I hoped I wouldn't experience. I'm being called to the Knesset right now. So,
all right.
I'm going to have, I really don't want to go right now because this conversation is more important than anything I'm going to do in the Knesset. I am trying so hard right now to wake people up to the need for annexation and for the need to preempt this probable terror campaign in the territories. I mean, it's just what little hair I have left is going right now. I don't know what to do except just keep screaming and yelling and trying to convince people. So maybe right now they're ready to listen to me. I don't know. But I have to keep trying.
If in fact you have to go now, that's what I understand. Is that right?
Unfortunately.
So, first of all, in that case, I wish to thank you. It's been very instructive. And I think this has been an important conversation. There's much more to be said, and therefore, with your permission, we will pick this up and continue on another occasion in the near future.
Amen.
And I want to state for the record that I agree with everything that you said, except for one thing. That's about not annihilating our enemy. On that count, I am more of a barbarian apparently than you, and I'm proud of it. And I will explain more about that on another occasion. Otherwise, we will get involved in a long conversation. Now, you can't afford that right now.
I refer to our enemies right now as Amalekim.
Yes, well, I've been saying that for 40 years.
Okay,
so we're on the same page.
I'm catching up to you.
And when I say that I've been saying this for 40 years, I'm not making this up. Things that I said on this topic were recorded at that time, and things I wrote at that time. And as you said, I was looked at in the most unusual manner by almost everybody to whom I said these things. Something wrong with this guy. He's barbaric. He's savage. He's violent. He's not normal.
No, you're very realistic.
And yes, I think I am realistic, and we all have to be realistic. And the Torah, more importantly, it doesn't matter what I think or even what you think. It matters what Hashem thinks, what the Torah tells us. The Torah instructs us how to deal with evil, with pure, distilled evil.
You eradicate it.
And the only solution for that is Maho Timhad Zecher Amalek Mitahat Hashemayim. That's it. Destroy them utterly and completely. We will let you go. It's been a pleasure and an honor. Thank you so much, and we will speak again sometime soon. Bezrat Kol Tov.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Bye.